Joining me at the table, Maya Berry, Executive Director of the Arab American Institute, and Ken Ballen, former federal prosecutor, president and founder of the research group Terror Free Tomorrow. And Ken, I want to begin with you because you wrote a book in which you went about the process of interviewing people who had been drawn into a very, very extremist version of Islam. What did you learn in those interviews that surprised you that we may not be thinking of as we think about what looks like this mysterious psychological process?
What surprised me is how, quote, normal and everyday the young men, and they are young men, let's remember this, they're between the ages of 16 and 30. That's the vulnerable group. They're normal, they're leading everyday lives, and they join ostensibly, Chris, for political or religious reasons. But if you dig beneath the surface into their psychological makeup, if you really understand what's going on with them, you'll discover some kind of break in their personal lives. Something going wrong, a failed love affair, a family conflict, an alienation, as we see in this case, and that leads them to join this movement. So whether they self-radicalize over the internet or they're a part of a collective group, they end up joining because of some kind of personal issue that oftentimes we're unaware of. And the political or religious reasons for that are more the dressing, the gown, the outer garment, and not the inner propelling motive.
So is there, when you scratch the surface, is there this massive distance between what we think of as jihad and extremism in that sense and something like Columbine or something like one of the other disturbed lone shooters that we see, where we don't start to ask, I think we don't go down that same road of what got to them? There's some kind of darkness there that we're willing to kind of accept and walk away from.
Right. I don't think there's that much of a difference, actually. I think the difference is in the community or the values they may be espousing, but oftentimes these young men are motivated by a sense of alienation and personal crisis that is so deep inside them that they grab hold of something.
I thought, Maya, that the moment in the mosque around Martin Luther King was such a fascinating one in terms of this intra-Muslim moment. I mean, and a moment in a mosque in which someone is really being disruptive and kind of, you know, I've had to deal with not an extremist in that setting, but sometimes you'll get someone at an event that stands up and starts yelling about 9/11 being an inside job or something, and there's this kind of awkwardness that sets over the room. And I was wondering what your reaction was reading that account. I found it very gripping.
Well, I think any time that someone is offended by the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, you get a sort of an insight into where their perspective is. And I think it's very telling that the community was shocked. They talk about that evening sort of turning around and saying, what's he complaining about? That simply didn't make sense. But for me, it's to understand that you have to commit an act of violence like this, you have to have a complete disregard for humanity. And I think within that is a certain level of hatred, whether it's, as you talk about, this level of alienation, maybe even for oneself. We can, start to have this conversation in a totally different direction. But for them to engage in this kind of act, for them to feel this way.
Suspected of engaging, we should be
sure,
clear.
the speculation is as
right.
we know it. So, and I think that the moment with Dr. King, the moment with complaining about a Thanksgiving turkey, the idea that there is speculation he complained that his siblings were too Americanized. I mean, all of this is the kind of thing that is just very alien for a lot of folks.
Very interesting reporting today about a friend of Tamerlan who seems to have been in some ways part of the cause of the trigger of this radicalization, who himself was a convert. And I've read a variety of accounts of people converting, and there's, of course, a cliche, right, about the zeal of the convert. And how often has that come about? There's
less often, I think. I don't think that's the typical. You know what's so interesting, too, about folks who engage in this is that they believe they're doing the right thing. They believe they're doing good. And they become so convinced that they're serving God in this cause that they don't see their acts as evil. They don't see themselves as being sociopaths or not caring about other people, because for many people, these are acts of good that they're doing on earth. So, and that's an important framework to remember.
Well, and I think the reason this is really important is because people are hearing this, right? And I think actually the reporting on this, I think, has been pretty good so far, and people's reaction in terms of, and Deval Patrick has been very clear, and Barack Obama has been very clear about we're not going to say that like all boxers might go on to become horrible murderers, right? If there's that there's a distinction here between what these two people are alleged to have done and the faith they had. But I think that the point there when you say, well, this started out as normal people, it gives me almost this kind of awful feeling, right, of like, well, you never know who's around the corner. And what you're saying is that it's more a psychological story than a sociological one, right? That there's something happening internal, and that framework, which is a framework we use when we apply it to all kinds of other events that happen, might also be applicable here.
But we haven't used it. And I think it's an important one. We haven't used it with regards to acts of terror committed by someone who professes to be Muslim. And I think that's the important part of this. So whether it's a convert, whether we talk about this spectrum of radicalization, being a devout Muslim doesn't make you more likely to commit an act of terror. That's simply false. So as we look at these indications, we have to be careful about the way we frame this. And frankly, that's why I think this is such an important conversation that we're having, to try to understand this in a deeper way than resorting to the kinds of language that often comes after attacks like this.
All right, if you spent the last few days watching Fox News and reading conservative media, you've heard an entirely different story about why the Boston Marathon bombings happen. We're going to give you the Cliff's Notes version up next.
Terrific work by the FBI and the police, especially in the past 5 days of last week. That being said, based on what we're learning right now, did they drop the ball?
The ball was dropped in one of two ways. The FBI missed a lot of things as one potential answer, or our laws do not allow the FBI to follow up in a sound, solid way.
Did the FBI fail? I would say they probably... something slipped through the cracks for them.
The FBI dropped the ball here. There's no question about it.
They dropped the ball here. There's no doubt about it.
If he was on the radar and they let him go, he's on the Russians' radar. And why wasn't a flag put on him?
This is at least the fifth case I'm aware of where the FBI has failed to stop someone who ultimately became a terrorist murderer.
All right, in the right-wing media, and sometimes the not right-wing media, the story right now, today, is that the FBI dropped the ball. And the reason for the allegations of ball dropping, or that we now know the FBI questioned Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older brother, in 2011, after Russian authorities warned the U.S. they thought he may have connections to radical Islam. After a thorough investigation, the FBI found no evidence that Tamerlan was connected to any domestic or foreign terrorism activity and cleared him. But this idea that because Tamerlan was cleared, the FBI has somehow negligent gets to the very heart of the matter that we've just been discussing, which is where does the line between an extremist belief system and criminality get drawn, particularly by the state? If the FBI interviewed Tamerlan and found he wasn't doing anything illegal, he wasn't engaged in any violence or plotting any, what exactly do we want the government to be doing in that situation? Right now, there are forces aligned to construct a story about how the FBI didn't surveil enough, how our pesky laws got in the way of catching the terrorist, and those stories will be used to call for more surveillance and new laws. So we must be very clear about what exactly we want from law enforcement, what we want them to do when confronted with a situation like what they apparently encountered with the older Tsarnaev brother. Let's bring in Carol Rose, Executive Director of the ACLU of Massachusetts. And Carol, I want to get your response to the story that is emerging that this was the FBI dropping the ball.
Right. Well, I mean, first, we don't have all the information about exactly what happened, so we're all speaking from news reports and not from actual knowledge.
Do it every night.
Do it every night. But that noted, I mean, you have to wonder, and I'm sure Congress will try to find out what happened. The FBI clearly wasn't lacking the authority. They had the authority, presumably, to interview this guy, but they apparently didn't have the ability or willingness or whatever to do the follow-up. And one has to go back to the question about some of these theories that are now discredited about radicalization. Is it possible that this guy didn't fit the profile that they were looking for under some of these discredited FBI theories of Islamic radicalization?
Oh, that's interesting. So wait. This is a tentative criticism of the FBI from the other side, which is that it's possible that they were too bound by some preconception of who would be a possible jihadi that they were not able to see something in front of them.
Right. I mean, we don't know. So I'm concerned about speculating, but one wonders, maybe they were thinking, well, if these guys are Chechen, you know, they hate the Russians. They don't hate us. Right. And so this goes back to why we need to be careful not to assume that these theories of radicalization are somehow going to lead us to the bad guys. It's important that law enforcement focus on people's actions and actually use traditional policing, not somehow giving them more surveillance or more authority. The FBI had the authority to interview this guy. They had the authority to interview him before he went overseas. Presumably, they had the authority to interview him when he got back, and they just failed to do so.
So here's the question I have for you, Ken, is this. Okay, Carol just said the word of police work, right? So traditional police work, the idea is like the crime happens, you figure out who did it, right? There's whole framework changed after 9/11, and I don't think bizarrely so. People wanted to make sure we prevented the next attack, and prevention meant this something that looked a lot more like intelligence than solving a crime after the fact, right? So there's some group of people, there are jihadi websites, and there's chat boards that you sometimes will read translations of people that follow this world. And the question is, how much is it an indicator of someone's involvement in that stage, right? I'm posting to chat boards, to actually becoming someone who would do something like plant a bomb among a crowd of people.
The problem is there's no predictive path. I think many people will go on to the chat boards or explore jihadist websites. Suppose I'm interested in them just to see what they're thinking. Does that mean that I'm going to engage in violent actions? Suppose I'm part of a community of a Muslim and are interested in seeing what these people are thinking in order to refute it. So I don't think it tells you a lot. And for a lot of young men, it may just be a way of acting out or experimenting. And there's no predictive path between looking at propaganda online and becoming a violent extremist. You just can't draw a straight line.
I think Ken's right about that, Chris. And I also think we have to be really mindful. If we decide that we want our police to start spending a lot of time tracking down people based on the websites they visit, for example, we're going to be targeting a lot of innocent people, arguably alienating a lot of people, and in the meantime missing the people who may actually have bad intent. And so I think that's a real bad direction to go.
Let me play the skeptical the conservative here, because before we all sort of sitting in a hot tub of consensus. I mean, there's some degree to which you do want. I mean, if someone is going through a process in which they are increasingly aligning themselves with, there's both the question of aligning themselves with the belief system, right? But then there's also a question of any kind of operational ties, or are they having actual communication with people? I mean, there's some level at which I feel like we want to know what's going on in that process, or is it that we can't really do anything until until we nab them maybe buying the gunpowder?
Well, the thing is, we do want to know. Absolutely. And you said the key word, operational. When they start meeting other people, when they start perhaps traveling to Russia, and allegedly Tamerlan went to a mosque where a very radical cleric was preaching. When there's operational information, it seems to me at that point the authorities need to investigate. Simply looking at the internet or reading material.
Or posting these
I mean, we're back
into YouTube.
Well, I think you're in a very, I mean, the FBI is going to be spending, as Carol said, a lot of time looking at people's mail, if you will, and not finding out what they're actually doing. I mean,
I think this is where we're getting into murky water here in terms of talking about a radical imams giving speeches. We're talking about committing acts of violence and targeting innocent people. That's where the conversation needs to be about. At what point does a YouTube video become a decision for someone to actually engage in acts of terror? That's where I think a conversation can focus. And I have to say, in terms of the conversation we just had about speculating, you can speculate on television. I can speculate as a private citizen. But what I don't want to see are policymakers who examine what happens in Boston and turn this into speculating and changing policy, the actual policy impact of what we can see now.
And we have Lindsey Graham, who's already talking about the fact that he had ties to quote Islamic thought should be enough. We have Peter King, Republican from New York, who's urging greater surveillance of Muslim communities, saying we need to get rid of all this political correctness.
Surveillance program that everybody can admit, who's reasonable and looked at the data, has produced nothing and actually alienated our community, which could make it even more problematic to do proper law enforcement.
And in
fact, I think
please.
Maya's right. I mean, a huge number of tips have come in that have prevented crimes and other attacks. And in fact, in this case, there was a tip from the Russian government. In the underwear bombing case, there was a tip from the family. In 9/11, there were tips.
Right.
And because the FBI was so busy gathering so much information, they were unable to actually analyze it and actually respond to the real-world tips that were coming in that might, in fact, have helped to prevent some of these attacks.
The signal noise problem is the big practical one.
That's
if
right.
you get too much information. Maya Berry of the Arab American Institute, Ken Ballen of Terror Free Tomorrow, Carol Rose of the ACLU of Massachusetts. That was a great conversation. Thank you. All right, people always ask, what is wrong with Washington? And today we found out one of the biggest problems in Washington will leave Washington at the end of his term. We'll bid him adieu. That's coming up.